One day during class, the student group noticed a new girl. She appeared out of nowhere, as if from another world. Every morning she arrived in different luxury cars, not just one, but several. Their worth making people whisper among themselves. There was something elusive about her that attracted the attention of everyone she passed. She was tall, slim, a blonde who seemed completely detached from the surrounding hustle and bustle. Her clothes screamed high fashion. Perfectly chosen outfits, heels unlike those other girls wore, and a handbag that looked like it could cover the cost of an apartment in a small town. But all that was just an outer facade, one that could easily mislead anyone. Despite her obvious style and successful image, one thing was clear. She was nothing like the people around her at the university. The girl named Victoria always remained distant, almost untouchable. Her gaze was always fixed on the horizon, as if she were in a different world, not in a classroom surrounded by students who never stopped talking about the latest party or discussing their courses. It was Emily, the quiet and modest brunette, who noticed that behind all the glam and shine, there was something much deeper. Emily was the type of person who preferred to observe rather than participate in group chats. While the other girls in the group, like Rebecca, discussed what car Victoria had arrived in, what brands she was wearing, and how much time she spent creating the perfect look, Emily was thinking about something else. She noticed how Victoria always tried to avoid everyone, hiding behind empty conversations and indifferent stares, never really engaging in meaningful discussions. She was silent, and that silence was magnetic. Emily started to watch her during breaks. Victoria sat in a corner, either glued to her phone or reading something on her laptop. There was nothing loud or provocative in her behavior. She didn't show off, didn't try to draw attention. On the contrary, her way of staying in the background seemed almost ghostly. Why didn't she join the conversations? Why didn't she try to make friends with anyone in the group? Why did this blonde, who seemed to embody the ideal, stay on the sidelines even when the other girls were talking about the weather or the latest trend? Emily couldn't help but notice this. Every morning, she arrived at lectures, and with surprise, she realized that Victoria was still silent, as if she didn't want to be part of the frenzy. At some point, Emily even began to wonder if there was more to this silence than simple detachment. Perhaps Victoria wasn't who she seemed to be. Maybe behind her glamorous image was a completely different story. A story that didn't fit the successful, glamorous girl stereotype. One day, after class, Emily decided to approach Victoria. That day, she was sitting alone again, not trying to draw attention to herself. Emily walked up to her, unsure of how to start the conversation. However, when she spoke, Victoria didn't answer immediately. She looked at her, as if deciding whether to open up. "You always come alone," Emily said, feeling how hard it was to have this conversation. "Why don't you talk to anyone?" Victoria remained silent for a long time. It seemed like she was trying to find the right words without revealing too much, but eventually, she sighed and replied, "People don't understand what I'm thinking. Sometimes it's easier to stay in my own world. It helps me avoid unnecessary questions." Emily felt something warm tighten in her chest. Victoria, who seemed perfect to everyone, was just a person trying to deal with things that were too much for most people. And though she remained quiet and distant, she wasn't cold or arrogant. She just couldn't be part of a world that didn't know her real story. "But you're not alone," Emily said, her voice full of warmth. "We have each other. You don't have to hide." Victoria looked at her, and though her face remained composed, something new sparkled in her eyes. Maybe hope? Maybe an understanding that sometimes you need to take a step toward others so you don't get lost in this world? In that moment, Emily understood that Victoria was not just a rich girl from a different social class. She was a person who had hidden her inner world behind a glamorous facade because she was afraid of being misunderstood and rejected. And Emily felt that right then. She had a chance to be the person for Victoria that she could be herself with. And despite all the differences in their lives, a spark of understanding was born between them. Meanwhile, the group of students continued to discuss Victoria, her image, her style, her because she can. But Emily knew something more. And maybe this was just the beginning of their true friendship, where instead of stereotypes and bright masks, they could find sincerity and support. Ever since Emily first spoke to Victoria, she noticed that there was much more to her than the glamorous exterior she presented. Her daily observations of the girl became more and more intriguing. Victoria continued living her life the same way as always, driving to campus in expensive cars, always looking flawless, perfectly manicured nails, impeccable makeup, and stylish clothes. But there was more to her than just her looks. One day, during a philosophy lecture, Emily overheard a conversation Victoria was having on the phone. Victoria mentioned two words that immediately caught Emily's attention: Milan and Paris. These words stirred up a rush of emotions in Emily. Milan and Paris, two cities that were commonly associated with the world of fashion, art, and elite circles. Students didn't usually drop names of places like that in everyday conversation. These weren't just typical tourist destinations, they were cities that not everyone could afford to visit, let alone live and work in. While her classmates were talking about their summer plans, university parties, and trips to nearby resort towns, Victoria mentioned Milan and Paris as places she had already been to and maybe planned to return to. For her, those cities didn't seem extraordinary at all. To Emily, this was a revelation because Victoria hadn't emphasized her travels. Instead, she'd stayed in the shadows of her more obvious and superficial interests. Emily was intrigued, but that wasn't the only moment that made Emily pause. Soon came the day of Victoria's presentation on her ecology research project. Emily knew that Victoria had chosen this topic, but was sure she wasn't really invested in it. The subject seemed too serious and deep for a girl who seemed to care more about how she looked and which brands she wore. However, when Victoria started her presentation, Emily was shocked. Her voice was different. It was full of passion and conviction. The Victoria Emily had spoken to just weeks ago about surface-level things suddenly revealed an incredible depth of knowledge about how human activities were affecting wild animal populations, the threats they faced, and the conservation measures she firmly believed should be taken immediately. There was not a hint of the usual lightheartedness or vanity that defined her outward image. She was genuinely living and breathing the topic. Emily noticed the way Victoria's eyes lit up as she talked about the importance of preserving biodiversity, protecting nature, and how humans were unknowingly destroying what they couldn't restore. This was a completely different side of Victoria, and for the first time, Emily saw her not as the blonde with perfect makeup, but as a person who deeply cared about the future of the planet. After her presentation, when Victoria left the classroom, she looked a bit tired, but there was something in her expression that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just satisfaction from completing her work. It was a real sense of having done something important, something that maybe not everyone could fully appreciate. Emily decided to approach her. "Victoria, your presentation was amazing," she said sincerely. "You not only prepared well, but you really believe in what you're saying." Victoria looked at her and froze for a moment, as if surprised by the simplicity of the compliment. Then, after a brief pause, she replied, "Thank you. This really means a lot to me, but a lot of people don't understand why I chose this topic. They all think I'm just a shallow girl who only cares about looking good and visiting fashionable cities. But I really care about what's happening to our world." Emily felt that this moment was significant. They were standing on the brink of something more than just a casual conversation between classmates. Victoria, like all of us, wore many masks, and, as it turned out, behind the shine and luxury, there was a person who genuinely cared about the future. In those moments, Emily realized that sometimes the brightest and most successful people could be hiding deep inner struggles and aspirations that the world doesn't know about. They might be overwhelmed by doubts we don't see, or be on a path of finding their true values. But this discovery only raised more questions. What else was hidden behind Victoria's image? Why did she always keep to herself, despite her obvious intelligence and passion for serious topics? And what was really behind her desire to remain so unattainable to those around her? All of this remained a mystery to Emily, but she already knew she needed to learn more. After all, maybe these answers were the key to understanding what was really behind Victoria's puzzling and sometimes strange behavior. One chilly autumn day, As the vibrant leaves rustled underfoot, Emily, as usual, walked out of the mall after finishing her shift, heading toward her car. The wind was sharp, cutting through the fabric of her coat, but Emily didn't pay it much mind. It had been a busy day, and her thoughts were preoccupied with her own things. However, what she saw in the parking lot made her stop in her tracks. Not far from the entrance, next to one of the parked cars, she spotted a figure she never expected to see in this place, let alone in this situation. Victoria. Yes, that girl, the one everyone thought was the epitome of perfection. Glamorous with flawless nails, always in high heels and expensive accessories, Victoria was kneeling on the cold asphalt, carefully breaking pieces of sausage to feed a large, scruffy stray dog. Emily froze, unable to look away. The blonde who had always seemed so untouchable and disconnected from real life wasn't just someone you could judge by her appearance. Victoria was calm, unconcerned about the cold, not bothered by the way the wind made her coat flutter, or by the possibility that some passers-by might notice this odd moment. She cared for the dog like a mother cares for her child, with such naturalness that it almost seemed supernatural. Emily crept closer, trying not to be seen, but she couldn't believe her eyes. Victoria, sitting on the cold ground, treated the animal with such care that it seemed like it was the most important thing in the world. With every piece of sausage she carefully and lovingly brought to the dog's face, Victoria seemed to melt into the moment, oblivious to the people around her, to time itself. At that moment, she wasn't the blonde with the designer handbags and perfect makeup. She was just a person, giving her care and attention without any expectation of recognition or praise. Once the dog finished the last bite, Victoria gently petted its head and stood up, still oblivious to her surroundings. Emily, standing in the shadows, felt a strange emotion welling up in her chest. Just when she thought Victoria would walk away, she unexpectedly did something that completely shattered all the stereotypes. Instead of simply walking off, she took the dog by the collar and carefully, as if it were her own pet, placed it in her luxurious car. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. That very blonde, who always showed off her flawless image, in high heels, expensive clothes, and with unshakable confidence, had just revealed another side of herself, one completely unexpected. Victoria had placed the stray dog in her car as if it were the most natural and important thing in the world. The dog behaved calmly, seemingly sensing it was now safe. Victoria gently closed the car door, then, nervously glancing around, she slid into the driver's seat and drove off in an unknown direction. Emily stood there, stunned. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the disappearing car, inside which sat the poor but now seemingly rescued dog. Until that day, Emily had thought that Victoria was just a facade, the perfect picture that others could dissect and talk about, but never look deeper into. She believed the girl was living on the other side of real life, following rules that didn't involve participation in anything dirty or low that didn't fit her status. She was convinced that Victoria was, at her core, superficial, living in the world of the rich and beautiful, in a world where things like helping those in need had no place. But that moment changed everything. Emily felt that Victoria's world, the one she had so carefully constructed for those around her, was actually much more complex than she had thought. Victoria turned out to be someone who not only cared about her appearance and status, but also showed true kindness, hidden behind the facade of her meticulously crafted image. Emily began to wonder, why did Victoria hide this side of her life? Why did she so carefully avoid talking about her empathy and care? Why was her compassion for homeless animals kept behind a mask of cold, untouchable personality? And how many other hidden sides of Victoria were there? Everyone must have their secrets. But Victoria, as the scene had shown, wasn't just hiding the mundane aspects of her life. She was hiding her ability to show empathy, her humanity, which didn't fit into the perfect image she had built around herself. As Emily stood there in the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just seen the tip of the iceberg. This moment made her see Victoria from a different perspective. There was more to her life than glamour and success. Maybe, deep down, there was a real strength, a strength no one had suspected, one that could mark the beginning of something new and meaningful in their friendship. The next day, Victoria didn't show up for class, which was unusual for everyone. Emily, as usual, glanced around looking for the familiar figure, the blonde in her stylish coat, high heels, and impeccable manicure. But today she wasn't there. Emily felt a strange sense of unease. Why would she skip class? Usually, Victoria was always on top of things, neat and focused on her studies, despite her glamorous surroundings. This was the first time Emily noticed that Victoria didn't just show up late. She didn't show up at all. One of the students during the break mentioned seeing Victoria off campus, though he didn't know exactly what she was doing there. He added that her car was parked near the old warehouses on the outskirts of town. Emily froze when she heard that. The warehouse buildings in that area had been abandoned for years, and no one had plans to fix them up. It was a quiet, desolate corner where very few people went. Why would Victoria be in such a place? Emily knew she had to find answers, even though her curiosity gnawed at her. She felt like this was important. Something about Victoria's sudden disappearance felt off. Maybe this was the moment when she could uncover another side of her personality, one she hadn't noticed before. When Emily arrived at the old warehouses, she stopped at a small parking lot behind which the cracked, decaying buildings loomed. From around the corner of one of the warehouses, she saw Victoria's familiar car, the expensive one that always drew attention. This was strange. Emily looked around to make sure no one else was nearby, then carefully made her way toward the building, deciding to get closer. A few minutes passed, and then Emily finally heard something that made her stop dead in her tracks. The sound of dogs barking, joyful and sharp, came from around the corner. Emily couldn't resist. She crept closer and peeked around the corner. There, among the trash and disrepair, she saw something she never expected. Victoria was kneeling on the ground, surrounded by several dogs. These animals were in the worst shape, dirty, emaciated, with wounds all over their bodies. But despite all of that, Victoria was right there with them, tending to each one with care. Emily couldn't look away. She saw Victoria gently treating a wound on one of the dog's paws, and was struck by how much love and patience she put into it. Her neat, manicured hands didn't seem to hinder her at all in working with the animals. Victoria wasn't concerned about getting her white gloves dirty or ruining her coat. Everything she did was focused on helping the animals. She fed them, petted them, wiped their dirty faces, and kept an eye on their health. Emily felt like an observer witnessing something incredible, something that could completely change her perception of Victoria. This girl, who had always seemed so unattainable and detached, was now truly open to the world, to animals that most people would go out of their way to avoid. What surprised Emily most was how natural Victoria seemed in all of this. It wasn't a performance. She wasn't doing it for show to impress anyone. It was a genuine desire to help. Victoria, of all people Emily knew, turned out to be someone who truly cared for those in need. This moment made Emily realize that caring wasn't about expecting praise or seeking recognition. Victoria did it because it came from her heart. Emily couldn't understand why Victoria never mentioned this side of herself. Why did she hide her kindness, this amazing part of her personality, so deep that no one could see it? Why did she always stay so cold and distant to everyone else, hiding her warmth from the world? Getting closer, Emily felt like her presence wouldn't go unnoticed, so she decided not to interfere and simply watch from a distance. She stood behind the corner, careful not to disturb Victoria, but she couldn't help but be in awe of what was unfolding before her. At that moment, Emily didn't feel what most people feel when they uncover something about someone: shock or confusion. Instead, she only felt a strange warmth and respect for Victoria. A few minutes later, it seemed like Victoria had finished caring for the animals. She gently petted each dog, then stood up, carefully gathered her things, and cleaned up the trash around her. After that, she went to her car, opened the door, and without looking back, got in and drove off. Emily felt like she needed to go home and rethink everything she had just witnessed. Lost in thought, Emily began to realize that her previous judgments about Victoria had been superficial. She wasn't just what she seemed. Victoria had been hiding her humanity beneath layers of glamour and luxury, and perhaps she didn't want to, but rather had to, because of the social status she was expected to maintain. But now Emily knew that behind the sparkle was a real person, with sincere feelings, capable of true kindness and care. When Emily got home, thoughts of Victoria wouldn't leave her. She wanted to understand what drove this girl, what motives and hidden reasons made her stay closed off from others, despite all the good she was doing. The next day, as Emily quietly stepped out from behind the corner, Victoria noticed her presence. At first, she didn't show much surprise. She simply turned and smiled, as if she had known all along that Emily would be there. There was no hint of annoyance in her eyes. In fact, Emily's presence didn't seem to faze her at all. It wasn't exactly unexpected, but in that moment, filled with care and tenderness, Emily could feel her stereotypes about Victoria starting to crumble. Victoria wasn't who she appeared to be. "Emily, come over here," Victoria said warmly. "Don't you want to help? These little guys definitely need your attention." Emily froze for a moment. She hadn't expected Victoria to offer her help. Should she go over? But realizing her presence had already been noticed, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, joining Victoria. She wasn't holding any gloves or tools, but she understood that it didn't matter. There was no need for flashy glamour or a perfect appearance here. It was just about being a human. They started working together. Emily filled the bowls with water and food for the dogs, while Victoria took care of each animal, checking their condition. She carefully treated a wound on one dog's paw, cleaned their fur, and checked their eyes and ears. Emily watched her every move, amazed at how easily and confidently Victoria handled everything. She could feel her heart melting at the care Victoria gave to these poor creatures. At one point, while Victoria continued to care for the dogs, Emily couldn't hold back her thoughts any longer. Inspired by what she was seeing, she felt the need to confess to Victoria how much her perspective had changed about her. "Victoria, I have to admit something," Emily began, her voice soft but sincere. "I used to think you were just spoiled and superficial. I thought you were all about appearance, always trying to please everyone. But now I see how much real depth you have, how much of it's hidden behind all those masks. You're an incredible person. I never thought you could be so deep and caring." Victoria paused her actions for a moment and looked at Emily. Her eyes sparkled, but she didn't respond right away. She just nodded quietly and went back to tending to the dog, but now with a special expression on her face. "You know," Victoria said after a few seconds, "I don't pay much attention to what people think. All those expectations and stereotypes they try to surround me with, I don't need that. I do what matters to me, and if I'm helping these animals or finding joy in simple things, that's what matters to me. But your words, Emily, they mean a lot to me. Thank you." Emily felt her heart fill with gratitude and relief. She realized that those simple words she had shared were not just a confession to Victoria, but a kind of revelation for herself. Emily had stopped judging Victoria based on appearances and stereotypes. Now she saw her for who she truly was, and the version of the girl she was witnessing in that moment was far more amazing than she could have ever imagined. When their work was finished, Victoria offered to give Emily a ride home. Though Emily hadn't expected such an offer, she accepted it, feeling that it was a good opportunity to continue their conversation. They got into the car, and Victoria started the engine. On the drive home, they talked about many things: life, caring for animals, and how important it is not to judge a person by their appearance. Emily began to realize just how limited her views had been before, both about the world and about people. She felt that there was still so much she had to understand, to learn how to see and appreciate. But today, she had already taken an important step. "You know," Emily said as they drove down the empty streets, "I used to think that caring for animals was just something people did when they didn't have their own life, their own business. But now I get it. Caring for them is actually part of what makes us real people. We can't just think about ourselves. We have to be able to show compassion and care. You do that, Victoria, and you inspire." Victoria smiled, looking at her through the rearview mirror. "You can do it too, Emily. We all can, if we open our hearts. I always say that true strength is in the ability to help someone who can't give anything back. And if you help someone, human or animal, expecting nothing in return, you've gained so much more than all the money in the world." Emily thought about her words. They drove through the streets, and in Emily's mind, new thoughts began to form. All those things she had once considered important, Status, money, appearance now seemed empty and unnecessary. What really mattered wasn't how you looked, but how you lived, how you treated the people and animals around you. Victoria had shown her that true value lay in sincerity and kindness. When they pulled up to Emily's house, she thanked Victoria for the ride and the conversation. Victoria smiled, nodded, and wished her a good day before driving off. Emily stood by her door, watching as Victoria's car disappeared into the dark. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she understood now that change starts with us. And those changes could be much more important than anything she had ever considered valuable before. Several months had passed since Emily and Victoria started working on the shelter project. Every detail, every step had been crucial. Finding a location for the shelter, handling paperwork, raising funds, and recruiting reliable volunteers. And now the moment had finally arrived. The shelter was officially open. Emily stood next to Victoria, looking at the crowd that had gathered to support the cause and the staff with whom they'd spent so many long hours selecting the best animals for the shelter. She was overwhelmed with emotions. So many efforts, so many late nights, so many doubts. But now, all of it had paid off. Emily couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished together. Victoria was at the center of attention, talking to local media representatives, accepting congratulations, but her eyes were calm and confident. She knew her life was about to change, and it wasn't a life filled with luxury cars and glamour. Now, she was dedicating her energy and time to something that truly mattered. "This really happened," Victoria said, walking over to Emily after the guests had left and the day was turning into evening. "We did it, and I still can't believe that everything that seemed impossible is now a reality." Emily smiled and looked at her friend. She could feel their friendship growing stronger each day as they became more and more connected, understanding each other better. Of all the lessons she had learned while spending time with Victoria, this one stood out the most. Don't judge a person by their appearance. Sometimes what's hidden beneath the surface can be much more valuable and meaningful. "You didn't do it alone," Emily replied. "We did this together. I never would have believed I'd be part of something so important. I thought I'd always be fine just working at the university, but this is something else." Victoria nodded and looked at the volunteers who were tidying up, putting the final touches on the shelter. The people they'd invited to help had started to feel responsible, committed to the cause. Victoria could hear the sounds of happiness echoing from every corner of the shelter. Animals who had found new families, volunteers who were increasingly invested in the lives of these creatures. "We can help so many," Victoria said, "and I believe this is just the beginning. We won't stop here. This isn't just a shelter, it's a movement. We need more than just saving animals. We need to teach people to be responsible, to change their attitudes toward those who can't stand up for themselves." Emily felt her heart swell with pride and admiration. She saw how much Victoria had changed. From the glamorous girl who once sparked envy and resentment, she had become a woman who truly cared about others, a woman who was ready to fight for what she believed in. "Victoria, you inspire me," Emily said, smiling. "Your ideas, your determination, your strength, you're changing the world." Victoria looked at her and quietly said, "Without you, I wouldn't have made it. You showed me that it's okay to be more open, that it's worth trusting people. I've always been alone, thinking I could do everything on my own. But you, Emily, have become my support. And that means the world to me." A few more days passed, and the shelter's life continued to stabilize. Emily and Victoria worked side by side, solving emerging problems, helping new animals, and making future plans. Victoria was planning to expand the shelter, while Emily was organizing educational programs to teach the local community how to properly care for animals and treat them with respect. There was never a moment of doubt, not a single second when they wished they could go back. Every morning when Victoria woke up, her thoughts were not consumed by glamour or expensive things, but by how to help more animals and make the shelter the best place for them. She felt like she was finding her true path. Emily felt that this work brought her more fulfillment than she had ever expected. She even began to think about leaving the university and dedicating herself fully to this important mission. She knew that Victoria couldn't and didn't want to go it alone, and she was ready to be by her side until the end. In the evening, when the work was done and the day was coming to a close, Victoria and Emily sat on a bench in front of the shelter, watching the sunset. It was their moment, their quiet victory. Ahead of them was a long road, but they were ready to walk it together. And this was only the beginning. "You know, Emily," Victoria said, "I used to think happiness came with success, money, and recognition. But now I realize that happiness is when you're doing something that really matters. And when there's someone by your side, someone who supports you when you're not alone." Emily smiled, looking into her eyes. She could feel that this friendship, this shared mission had become a new life for her, an integral part of her existence. "You're right. This is the real meaning of life. And I'm so glad I get to be with you on this journey." They sat in silence, enjoying the quiet and the moment. In their hearts, there was so much hope, and they knew that ahead of them lay not just hard work, but joy. The joy of knowing they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of those who needed their help.